I'm Simon Pollard and I'm Adjunct Professor of Science Communication in the College of Science, and I'm here to tell you about how I became passionate about what I do, which is actually work on spiders. And if you have to go back to when I was 7 years old, and I developed an interest in zoology, and I think it was largely my uncle's influence, who was a psychologist at the University of Canterbury, and he really was an animal psychologist and in many ways an early evolutionary psychologist, and he just seemed to know everything. And so from a 7-year-old boy's point of view, universities represented a place where you learnt everything. And my passion for zoology never wavered, and I came to the University of Canterbury. My first year was in 1974, and I did zoology, but I didn't have a specific area of zoology that I was necessarily interested in. And that came along when I was 20, in my third year in zoology, and it was like a light went on in my head, and that light said, you're going to study spiders. And so I did, and I was doing a third year entomology course where I needed to have a collection of spiders, and I went out, collected them, and started to learn about spiders within the context of doing a zoology degree. And I think what was very fortuitous for me was that the following year, Robert Jackson came from the US and joined the faculty in the zoology department, and Robert was a spider biologist, and so I really became his apprentice, and we've worked together since we first met in 1978. First I was a student and then I was a PhD student, and we've worked together. And so I did a PhD on spiders at the University of Canterbury. And when you say to somebody you did a PhD on spiders, people have this idea that the only people interested in what you did are other people that work on spiders, but it's not true. When you do a PhD, you're really using the animals as a tool to understand evolutionary biology and to understand a little bit more about life on Earth, the evolution of life on Earth and how things tick. And so my interest was on spider feeding mechanics, how they got the insides out of prey. And I had this wonderful microbalance I used that weighed down to 100 millionth of a gram, so I could do these very, very minute things and learn about how they got the insides out. And after I finished a PhD, which was what most people do, was that I pursued postdoctoral fellowships, and I was very fortunate to get a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Virginia in the US, as well as one at the University of Alberta in Canada, and one in England at Cambridge University. So I left New Zealand. It was my second time overseas, and it was a slightly scary experience, packing your life up into a suitcase. And also at that time, I really thought that I probably wouldn't come back to New Zealand. I thought that I'd end up being in North America somewhere. So I carried out these postdocs, and at that time, around the time that I left New Zealand, I also became interested in more public understanding of science, or taking my interest to a broader audience. And I may have inherited these abilities. My grandfather was actually on faculty here in engineering, and he was a very good public speaker. And so I pursued that interest both through developing an interest in natural history photography and natural history writing. And so when I took those interests to the US, I was very fortunate in having opportunities, both with my photography and writing for various magazines in the States. And I've had a long-term relationship with Natural History magazine in New York and have written for them for around about 20 years. And my natural history photography is largely pursued through an agency in New York, and I've been fortunate to get to various places around the world and take photographs of bugs, and that's a way of illustrating the science I do, as well as having them used in exhibitions and books, etc. So I think one of the messages I take, one of the messages I say to people pursuing science is, I mean, you could laugh that you're studying spiders, but it really is often, it presents opportunities you couldn't have imagined. And I've been very fortunate in being able to pursue both photography and writing, as well as documentary advising. And I've been involved over the last 15 or 16 years with being an advisor often for the BBC and other production companies in natural history documentaries. And that's again an opportunity that provides material for photography and stories as well. And I think some of my most memorable experiences have been being an advisor, where you really are finding out things about animals that nobody has known before, and that's part of the satisfaction of science. And I think what drives me as a scientist has always been curiosity. And it's like Albert Einstein said, you know, you want to be in awe of the mysterious. And I think it's uncovering those layers. And, you know, you look in our world now, and I look around colleagues at the University of Canterbury and other universities, and often what they're involved with is so incredibly specific, using such specific technology, and they're just adding those tiny pieces to the puzzle to understand life on Earth and why we're here, how long we've been here, and what's going on around us. One of the more unusual things I did after I finished a postdoc, or the various postdocs I had, I thought that I would end up teaching in a university in North America, but one of my first articles for Natural History magazine was on my PhD and postdoctoral work on how crab spiders feed. And Natural History was an in-flight magazine on an American airline, and a scientist from a research and development company in San Francisco read the article and he thought, this is astounding, these spiders are dissolving their food with enzymes outside their own bodies. And the light went on in his head and he thought, well, I wonder if this has any applications in industry, more specifically in detergents. So imagine if you made the definitive detergent that used something like spider enzymes to get your shirts even whiter. And so I worked with them for 3 years, and that really involved me being back in New Zealand and developing techniques to extract spider digestive fluid without hurting the spiders, and then that fluid was sent to San Francisco. Now, that was 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago. Nowadays, technology's moved on so much that you really could just take the spider and extract the genes responsible. So that was an opportunity that got me back into New Zealand, and I was travelling an enormous amount with this work as well, and a job came up at Canterbury Museum as a curator of invertebrate zoology, and I was actually more or less living in LA at the time, but I decided that I needed some discipline and stability in my life, so I applied for the job, and I've worked at Canterbury Museum for the last 15 years. One of the other areas I've also been involved with is being an advisor on natural history documentaries. And we all watch natural history documentaries, and you see these 3 or 4 minute sequences, which usually is related to somebody's research around the world, whether it's on where snow leopards are living in Pakistan or on animals living underwater, etc. And the BBC has been interested in my work and my collaborative work with Robert Jackson over the years, and has featured in a number of documentaries. And so the first time I did this was in 1996, and I spent a month in Sri Lanka working on a sequence on spiders for a bigger documentary on the Indian subcontinent. And that's led to a longer relationship with the BBC, and I was involved in a documentary called Spiders from Mars, and that was on jumping spiders, and that was narrated by David Attenborough, and myself and the producer wrote the script for David. And that was a lot of fun, and also meeting him was a lot of fun, which really he was exactly as you would expect, and he continues to be exactly as you would expect. And more recently, I had been working in Borneo on spiders that live in pitcher plants, and the BBC were interested in having a sequence on that work for their series Planet Earth. And so I spent 3 weeks with them in an area I'd been to a number of times in Borneo, in Sarawak, and I arrived with my little pile of gear, and they arrived with their 400 kilograms of excess luggage, and we spent 3 weeks filming these spiders jumping into pitcher plants and catching food. And I was seeing that wonderful expertise that somebody who's been a natural history cameraman for 30 years brings to these jobs. So my involvement in that, and has been over the years, is more or less suggesting sequences that would work and how you film them. How can you get the spider to do a somersault? What does the spider think about being in bright lights and things like that? So I guess I seem to have a knack about knowing the animals and knowing what works, and that's led to this relationship with them, because you may say, look, you've got to film the spider doing a somersault, and it might take you a year. That's not going to work. They want to know something that will work in a matter of weeks. And so I've enjoyed that relationship very well, because most of the people, often the cameramen and the producers, are zoologists themselves, and yet they've had a passion for filmmaking, and so the combination of that works very well. I often get asked, how did you get involved with being an advisor on natural history documentaries? And it usually comes about from my scientific work, from publications from that work. So when the BBC's doing a series like Planet Earth, they're looking for stories, and the source of those stories are usually the papers and popular articles written by scientists. And that was the basis of my relationship, that they'd read some of my work on spiders and said, well, that sounds like a great sequence. Would that work? You know, would it be possible to film it? Where would we have to go? What are the logistics of working with these animals? And so that's how that relationship started. And people, yeah, I mean, you can't guarantee that they're going to be interested in your work, but I always go back to when I was an undergraduate, and I became interested in spiders, and it made perfect sense to me. And I remember one of the entomologists in the zoology department that taught me, Peter Johns, one of Peter's passions were millipedes. And he said with all seriousness that he was off to the International Millipede Conference in Italy. It just seemed very funny, a whole bunch of people getting together to talk about millipedes. But I, most years, if I can, go to the American Arachnological Society meetings where 100 to 150 spider biologists, mostly from the US, get together for a meeting. I grew up in Christchurch, and I've lived here all my life, except when I lived overseas for a number of years, and also tend to travel a lot. But this is my home. And I actually, on both my parents, we were about 5 generations that have more or less lived in Christchurch. And there's no question that the most important event in Canterbury's history have been these earthquakes. And I've been very fortunate not to lose anybody and to still have a house. And I know it's been very, very difficult for many people. And it's very sad for me to see so much of the city becoming a car park. Especially, I lived in the inner city for 22 years, so I'm very, very familiar with it. But I'm also an optimist, and I can see that the new Christchurch will, in the 21st century, there's an enormous number of opportunities. And so I think that's the same with the university, is that think about 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time, this will be the place to come and study earthquakes in terms of engineering or geology. An enormous amount of data that's collected, probably the most studied sequence ever in the history of earthquakes on the world, especially in a developed country that has the technology to measure what's going on. So no, I'm very optimistic, and I think if I was starting my first year at the University of Canterbury, not in 1974 but in 2012, I'd still feel very optimistic about the future of the place. Over the years, people have asked me, why did you study spiders? And of course I said I was passionate about zoology, and spiders just seemed to suit me as an animal to study. And as I've mentioned, it presented me with opportunities I couldn't have imagined when I first started studying zoology and went on to do postgraduate degrees in zoology. And now, having supervised students and postgraduate degrees and spoken to huge numbers of groups about natural history and about studying zoology and what scientists do, people say, my son really loves bugs, but we feel he should go on and do medicine, or he should do something that's got a career goal at the end that's reasonably predictable and has a security about it. And I always say to them, if you are passionate about millipedes, but you feel you should do medicine, then pursue the millipedes, because you'll probably be a lot happier at the end of it. And I certainly see when I go to meetings like spider meetings, and if you pursued millipedes, you go to millipede meetings, is you see people that are passionate about what they're doing, and that gives their lives a quality that they may not have if they're in a job that they don't really want to be doing. When I did my PhD, I was very fortunate. There were a group of 5 of us that went through together in the zoology department, and we were really overachievers, and we were driven by what we were doing. We were there on Saturdays and Sundays working. We loved talking to each other about the science we did and suggestions about areas that we should go into, etc. So my suggestion is that passion is really one of the most important things about going on to do a postgraduate degree. If you drift into a degree because you're not sure what you want to do, it can be the worst of worlds. But as I found and my friends found, that if you're passionate about what you're doing, it is the best of worlds, and it's